today, Mr. President, to discuss. I move that we come out of the quorum call, Mr. President.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I rise today to discuss bipartisan legislation that will reauthorize the National Flood Insurance Program. And I want to talk a little bit about flood insurance first before I talk about our much-needed legislation. As many people know, but unfortunately some folks don't know, or maybe they forget, but if you have homeowners insurance on your home and you flood, you're not covered. Homeowners insurance does not cover flood. In order to be covered for flood, you have to have a separate policy. And about the only place you can go to get flood insurance is from the federal program, the National Flood Insurance Program. Now, that's a bit of an overstatement. It is possible to buy flood insurance from a private insurer, and certainly we want to encourage private insurers to participate more in the flood insurance market. But today, for the most part, if you want to carry flood insurance, you have to get it through the federal program, and that's called the National Flood Insurance Program. It's administered by FEMA. It is hard to overstate the importance of flood insurance to the American people. It's even harder to overstate the importance of flood insurance to the people of Louisiana. The gross domestic product in my state is about $220 to $230 billion a year. If you add up all the goods and services that we as Louisianians produce every year, it comes out to between $220 and $230 billion. Without flood insurance, you can cut that figure in half. We would have to, in effect, turn out the lights. There are 450,000 flood insurance policies in my state. Many of those people have to have flood insurance. It's a condition of their mortgage. So the flood insurance program, and more specifically the National Flood Insurance Program, is extraordinarily important to America, but it's even more extraordinarily important to the people of Louisiana. Today, we are introducing a bipartisan bill to reauthorize the National Flood Insurance Program. The current program expires in September. If we don't reauthorize it, most Americans who have flood insurance at the present time will no longer be able to access it. It is critical that the United States Congress act immediately. The bill that we are introducing, and I will explain in a moment who I mean by we, is bipartisan legislation. Now, there are a lot of issues that divide Congress today. And reasonable people are entitled to disagree over some of these very difficult issues. But there are also issues that we can come together on. And I would respectfully suggest, Mr. President, that flood insurance is one of them. We have put together a bipartisan coalition. Senator Bob Menendez from New Jersey, who happens to be a Democrat. Senator Cory Booker from New Jersey, who happens to be a Democrat. Senator Thad Cochran, chairman of our Appropriations Committee in the Senate from Mississippi. He is a Republican. Senator Marco Rubio from Florida, who is a Republican. Senator Bill Nelson from Florida, who is a Democrat. Senator Van Hollen from Maryland, who happens to be a Democrat. And more senators are coming on board. Today, we are introducing a bill. It's called the Safe National Flood Insurance Program Reauthorization Act. And SAFE, of course, is an acronym. It refers to sustainable, affordable, fair, and efficient. SAFE, the Safe National Flood Insurance Program Reauthorization Act. Let me tell you briefly what it does, Mr. President. Let me start with cost. It doesn't do a bit of good to offer someone insurance if they can't afford it. And too many times that has been the case with flood insurance. Right now, under the current program, the National Flood Insurance Program is allowed to raise a homeowner's flood insurance premium by 18%. Not 10%, not 12%, but by a staggering 18%, and to do that every year. If you're insuring a second home, let's suppose you have a vacation home, or if you are a businesswoman or a businessman insuring a commercial establishment, the national program can raise your premiums every year by 25%. Nobody can pay those kind of increases. Our bill would cap the amount that the flood insurance program can raise someone's premium at 10% annually. I wish we could cap it at 0% annually, but 10% is certainly a lot better for our people than 18% and 25%, respectfully. And if FEMA properly implements some other provisions of our act, which I'll talk about in a moment, there won't be any increases. Number two, our bill, the Safe National Flood Insurance Program Reauthorization Act, would extend the National Flood Insurance Program by 6 years. I wish we could extend it longer. I wish we could do 10 years or 15 years or 20 years. But it's necessary, of course, as you know, Mr. President, to get unified bipartisan support on this legislation. And we think 6 years, a 6-year authorization, is probably the best we can do to pass this bill. Number three, our bill will save about $750 million a year. Let me say that again. Our bill will save about $750 million each and every year to be used in the flood insurance program. And here's how our legislation would do it. Number one, as we know, the flood insurance program has a deficit. We've had a large number of natural disasters, floods, over the past several years in our country, unfortunately. We had Hurricane Sandy. We had Hurricane Katrina in my state, in Louisiana, last year. We had 2 horrible floods, both in the northern part of my state and in the southern part of my state. In a couple of instances, we had 23 inches of rain in 2 days. I don't care if you live on Mount Everest. You get 23 inches of rain in 2 days, you're going to flood. Those floods were very expensive. Those catastrophes and many others caused the National Flood Insurance Program to operate at a deficit. The deficit is $25 billion. Another way of stating that is that the program owes $25 billion in debt. But we owe it to ourselves. We don't owe it to a bank. We don't owe it to a foreign country. We don't owe it to any private entity. We owe it to ourselves. And we have been paying interest to ourselves out of the premiums, the cash flow, if you will, on the flood insurance program every year. That 10%, 10 cents out of every dollar that comes in the National Flood Insurance Program is devoted just to paying the interest on this debt that we owe ourselves. Our bill would suspend those interest payments for 6 years. That will free up about $400 million a year. Number two, we're also saving money by asking those who work with us in implementing the National Flood Insurance Program to sharpen their pencils. And let me explain what I mean by that. FEMA is in charge of the National Flood Insurance Program, but FEMA doesn't run the program, doesn't run the insurance company that administers the policies. FEMA hires private insurers in the private sector to actually run the program. We call that the Write Your Own program. Now, for the most part, those private insurers which administer the program do a good job. But they don't have any risk. They have zero risk, none, nada. The risk is on the National Flood Insurance Program, the federal government, and therefore the American taxpayer. We just hire the private insurers to administer the program, to collect the premiums, to sell the policies, to adjust the claims. So they have no risk. But yet we're paying them 31 cents out of every dollar that the program would take in. And our bill respectfully suggests that that's too much money. And while we appreciate the cooperation we get and the good work we get from the private insurers who help us administer this program, we're going to ask them to, actually we're going to tell them to reduce their compensation from 31 cents out of every dollar. That's going to save about $350 million a year. So we've just saved about $750 million a year for the National Flood Insurance Program. What are we going to do with the money? First, mitigation. With flooding, and it's inevitable that we're going to have floods. I don't know why bad things happen to good people, but they do. You can pay a little bit up front, or you can pay a whole lot later. And this is what I mean by that. If we spend the money on mitigation to protect against the flooding that we know will inevitably happen, we will save money for the American taxpayer in the long run. And we will use a portion of that $750 million in savings to mitigate against flood risk. By mitigation, I mean offering low or no interest loans to homeowners to elevate their homes so they won't flood, building levees, building flood walls. Our bill does not say specifically what mitigation measures should be taken, and it does not say which mitigation projects will be built. But it does say mitigation is the answer, not the complete answer, but part of the answer. We haven't done enough of it, and now we're going to have the resources to do it. The second way we're going to use that money, Mr. President, is to try to do a better job with mapping. We set rates in the National Flood Insurance Program based on the likelihood of someone to flood. We determine that likelihood by using maps, which are drawn by experts using computer models. We're not using the most up-to-date, state-of-the-art technology to draw those maps. If our bill passes, we will, including but not limited to a new technology called LIDAR. I confess I don't understand the technology, but it's called LIDAR, Light Detection and Range Technology, and it can be used to draw more accurate flood maps, to more accurately assess somebody's propensity to flood. Why is that important? You might be in a high-risk flood zone right now and paying a large amount of premium. With state-of-the-art technology, you may be put into a lower-risk flood zone and pay less. I'm not guaranteeing that result, but it's certainly possible. And in any event, we need to as accurately as possible assess the risk, and the only way to do that is through proper mapping. Our bill will also, Mr. President, include a provision that will allow Congress to provide better and greater oversight of FEMA in administering the program. And let me tell you specifically what it will do. The very able administrator at FEMA who handles the flood insurance program testified before the Banking Committee a few months ago, and he testified that if one of these private insurance companies that administers the flood insurance program for us has a lawyer or a consultant that's not doing his job, then FEMA doesn't have the authority to fire him. This bill will give FEMA the authority to fire that consultant. And here's why it's important. Most of the lawyers and the engineers and the other consultants that the private insurance companies hire to administer the program, help them administer the program on behalf of the National Flood Insurance Program, do a pretty good job, but some of them do not. And there have been recorded instances both in New Jersey and Louisiana where certain people, engineers and lawyers, have seen their mission to be to do anything they possibly can to keep a homeowner who's paid his or her hard-earned money to buy flood insurance from getting the money that they deserve if they flood, and that is just wrong. Now, if you're trying to defraud the National Flood Insurance Program, we need to fight you like a tiger. But if you have paid your premiums and unfortunately you have flooded, you're entitled to get your money. You should not be required to fight some engineer or some lawyer who's throwing up obstacle after obstacle after obstacle. And our bill says if there are consultants that do that and the private insurance companies don't want to fire them, then by God, FEMA will. And we're going to hold FEMA accountable. A couple of more points, Mr. President, that I will mention. This bill will also extend the coverage limits. Right now, the most flood insurance that one can buy if you're a homeowner is $250,000. Well, that's a lot of money. That doesn't cover some homes, given the rate of inflation in America today. And our bill would expand coverage limits to $500,000 for homes and $1.5 million for a commercial establishment. Mr. President, I've talked to some of my colleagues in the Senate and in the House, and some of them, I'm happy for them, represent states that haven't had any major floods. And I hope they never do. But if we've learned anything in the last few years in terms of flooding, we've learned that just when men and women think they can control everything in this world and we can control our destiny, we can't control God and Mother Nature. Flooding can happen at any time. Let me say it again. You can live in a mountainous state. You can live on top of a mountain. But if you get 23 inches of rain in 2 days, you're going to flood. And that's why you need flood insurance. That's why this bill is not just important to coastal states like Louisiana and Mississippi and Florida and New Jersey and Maryland. It's important to all Americans. This is a bipartisan bill. Have I mentioned that, Mr. President? I think I did. This is a bipartisan bill. It's supported by many Democrats. It's supported by many Republicans. It's a bill that's not only important for our economy, but it's important for the peace of mind of the American people. And I hope we won't let politics get in the way of doing what we know to be right. Once again, the bill is called the SAFE, which stands for Sustainable, Affordable, Fair, and Efficient National Flood Insurance Reauthorization Program. And I hope, Mr. President, that this body will come together as one and support this much-needed legislation. With that, Mr. President, I thank you, and I suggest respectfully the absence of